if you fell down, the expectation was you were just going to get up and rub some dirt on it. And as much as that is maybe outdated, wouldn't it be great to find this intersection between masculinity and empathy? Welcome to the Imperfect Men's Club Podcast. I'm Mark Aylward.
I'm Jim Gurley. Thanks for being here.
This podcast is a space for men to have real, raw, and often difficult conversations to help guide middle-aged men through making hard decisions in life. Both Jim and I are mentors focused on leading consciously. Tune in every week to have honest and often humorous discussions on well-being, personal growth, and professional development.
Enjoy the show.
Welcome to the Imperfect Men's Club Podcast. My name is Mark Aylward, and I'm here with my partner and colleague, Jim Gurley.
What's going on, Mark? How you doing this morning?
I'm doing well, Jim. I'm doing well. Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to this. I think in this episode, we really want to share with our listeners why we're here, why we made the podcast, who we are, a little bit about what we're going to talk about in future episodes, and why it might make sense for our listeners to pay attention and what they might get out of it. So I think the interesting part, Jim, is, and we were talking about this earlier offline, is, how we came together, how you and I met, because it's a recent relationship. It's a number of months as opposed to years. And I remember when we first started talking on the phone, you had come to one of the organizations that I work with, the Inspired Performance Institute, in search of a solution for some challenges that you were having. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but concussions from your sports history was a driving force behind that. And why don't you tell us a little bit about why you came to the Inspired Performance Institute and you and I started talking?
Yeah, I'd be honored to share that story with you, Mark. I think that this is something we all go through, but in my case, as you mentioned, there were some other discoveries along the way. But if I was to summarize it, it would just come down to a point in my life where I was struggling. I think we all struggle, but I didn't realize that the struggles were much more complicated than I realized in relationship to how our brain functions. It's actually started a couple of years ago. I'd taken on some, let's say, ambitious projects. And everything in my life, I've always seemed to be able to pull off or to produce the results that I had visioned, whether that's, again, a national championship, it's my patents, sales contests through my repping agency. But it's like I hit a wall. And I know that's a term that's often used, but when you hit the wall, you get to a point where you just can't, something's not right. And so I struggled. Tried to figure it out on my own, and then eventually said, "Hey, I don't want to take medication." Depression had set in, and never experiencing that, not realizing how damaging that could be to not just yourself but to the people around you. I started to seek other alternatives than the traditional methods of medication, and that's when I came across a Dr. Wood podcast, and he talked about a lot of things that I knew about, but high performance, and then also what's referred to as emotional concussions. So there's events in our life that happen, and then if you don't deal with them, they don't always just go away. And that's when I reached out to you, Mark.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that, Jim. As I'm listening to you talk, I'm thinking my mind is just racing. So my affiliation with the Inspired Performance Institute is I operate as their sales director and affiliate marketing manager. And so I'm the first line of contact when someone like yourself, hears a podcast or hears about Dr. Wood. I mean, you and I just started talking, and I asked you a few questions and you shared with me a few answers. And then there was one question you asked about this concussion thing. And I said, I really don't know. So let me go to Dr. Wood and get a response. And he came back with a response. And I remember you being very appreciative of me not speculating about whether I knew the answer to that or not. I pride myself in being really good at saying, I don't know. And so, and that just went forward. You scheduled an appointment, you hopped on a plane, you came out from California, and we ended up having coffee together, and you went through the session and some hyperbaric stuff. And then you went back and read a copy of his book on the plane ride with a highlighter, which I thought was awesome.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
And then you and I, this evolved into you and I saying, hey, we have a lot in common, and we see the world through a very similar lens. And so we started talking. It's like, I think we have an obligation to share some of this stuff, because between your contacts and your philanthropy and mentorship and just experience, and my similar contacts and, mentorship and teaching people, and this being of similar age, we thought, I think we have a lot to share with men of middle age that are either facing these challenges, about to face these challenges, or really confused and in the middle of it and just stuck. Like you said, hit a wall, get stuck, or whatever. So we're going to cover all kinds of shit. But it's all going to be focused on experiences as middle-aged men. And one of the things I'm interested in, Jim, is when you look back on your life in middle age, what's it like looking back? I mean, are you focused on the happy successes, the regrets, things you might have done differently? How do you feel about that when you look back from middle age?
Yeah, that is one of the core things that Dr. Wood walked me through, and that is explain how the brain functions, and then also the thoughts that get repeated. So I often was not looking back in a positive way, because my brain was jumping so forward, and that's part of what we'll get into a little bit later in terms of some things I've been dealing with all my life, but just becoming more aware of it, and then also wanting to continue to perform at a very high performance. So when you look back at things, your mind naturally wants to go back and scan, not necessarily the good things, but it starts to question all the things that you did and the outcome. And I have a very good life, by the way. I mean, if this is what most people, if they saw, my life and the house I live in, the cars I drive, and all the things I have, you wouldn't notice at all that inside I was at that time really struggling. So I was reflecting on maybe some decisions that I made that I regret. But if I was to be specifically, the best thing I ever did was marry my wife, and probably the most difficult thing I've ever done is marry my wife. And when I mean by that, I'll expand on what I'm saying there, is that she was the best thing that ever happened to me, because it completed me. But it also, like everything in life, you give up part of maybe who you are to accommodate that other person. And I think those were things I was covering up in the past with either 20 straight seasons of rugby and different things. And we have a great relationship, but that's a 35-year relationship. And as you grow, I think it's natural you start to grow apart and then together. So those are the kind of things we're going to talk about. I think every man and every marriage goes through these different periods.
Yeah, well, what's fascinating is it really doesn't matter the stuff you have, right? It's like, and it doesn't matter the exterior veneer that you show to the world. Everybody's a little bit fucked up. Everyone
Mm.
has problems. Everyone has challenges, and you can pretend you don't, but that's going to circle back around and bite you in the ass. I mean, one of the things I really appreciate about our talks is that you said, Mark, this is one of the first times in my life that I'm been willing to open up about this stuff, and like, because it, don't let me put words in your mouth, but the vulnerability of doing something like that is frightening. And then you discover that no, it's the opposite of that. Actually, once you start doing it, it's enlightening. And I think
Yeah.
it's really helpful to other people when you can put that empathetic face out there and say, look, I get it. I've been coaching people on their careers my whole life. I've been a headhunter and an entrepreneur, staffing company. So helping people with challenging positions has been kind of the thing that I've done my whole life. And I wear my emotions on my sleeve. And for the most part, that's worked well for me, but it's also allowed me to be taken advantage of. And I told you yesterday, one of my dad's favorite phrases is, if you're not being taken advantage of every once in a while, you're not being nice enough to people. But
Yeah. Let's talk about a couple of phrases I think we live by, and sometimes need to be updated. But going back to what you said, Mark, everybody's fucked up. In fact, everybody has daddy issues. That's a common thing. I think particularly women have daddy issues that um, are normal, but are never kind of discovered or dealt with. But so do men, right? Of what our fathers put on us, and the expectation, and also everybody has a slight bit of narcissism. I think that's a normal human trait. We are selfish beings. That's not unnatural to only think of yourself often. As much as we'd like to think we're always considering other people, we're here to survive. Um, and yeah, I appreciate what you're saying. We're all fucked up in our own way, and we should get some entertainment and some perspective and maybe some laughter on ourselves. I think what I find the most enjoyable people to be around are the ones that don't take themselves so serious that they can't laugh at themselves. And that's what I appreciate about you and your humility and honesty about, not always being on top. But I think it's normal for a man, particularly in our generation. When I say generation, you grew up in this 60s, 70s, 80s, to hold a persona, whether it's masculinity or macho-ness or whatever else. And like everything, that shit gets outdated. And that's what I hope to accomplish for our listeners, the podcast, that they get a new perspective, but an honest and maybe some humility and humor along the way.
Yeah, I think humility is big. I also think that we're all hypocrites, right? I mean, and these
Yeah,
aren't these aren't
absolutely.
necessary these aren't necessarily things that we have to avoid or apologize for.
Mhm.
And to your point about masculinity and macho-ness, I mean, we were raised in a generation where if you fell down, the expectation was you were just going to get up and rub some dirt on it. And as much as that is maybe outdated, wouldn't it be great to find this intersection between masculinity and empathy, right? Where masculinity is good, right? Abuse or toxicity of masculinity is bad. But the society that we live in, our culture, our environment, we need masculine people. We need masculine male people, just as we need feminine women. And that doesn't have to be mutually exclusive. Those are intended to be extremely complementary, right?
Yeah.
And the last point with regard to this kind of topic would be looking back, right? I don't know anybody that couldn't focus on enough regret to make them miserable for the rest of their lives. So when I look back on things that I regret, and there aren't a lot of them, we'll be talking about some of them upcoming, but those are learning experiences, right? If you look at them as learning experiences and you don't wallow in them, then you can move forward. But I know a lot of people that I've talked to, and Dr. Wood says it all the time. He says there's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with you. You are a product of your circumstances and environment. And what he has to offer is a tool to help put that in perspective, to really oversimplify it. And so when you think about things I mean, who could not think about stuff we could have done differently? I mean, you're making decisions back then with the knowledge that you have back then, not what you know now. So it's an absurd proposition, right?
Yes, and you're making decisions at different, again, stages of your life that was the best decision at that time. So it's not even fair to yourself to go back and then start beating yourself up or criticizing for things that you did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And that's often what we do unconsciously. And that's what I was doing, to the point where it was causing me a lot of stress and then ultimately depression. So, but yeah, let's talk about, Mark. What is your regret?
Yeah, I think there are two that kind of pop into my head, and I'll go chronological. Right, the first one was I went to the University of Notre Dame, and I had started playing basketball as a junior. I was a very good baseball player, and the world thought that that was my track to play professional baseball, and I was somehow convinced of that up until a point. But when I started playing basketball, when I grew into some height as a junior, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. The coach was terrible, the team was bad, but I'm like, I love this sport. I can't believe I didn't discover this sooner. And so my senior year, I was a starter on the varsity team. I made very rapid progress, and but I had not really any foundational coaching. I was playing street ball in a shitty system, but I was a good athlete. And then when I got to Notre Dame, I started playing intramurals, and I was completely intimidated by the notion of trying out for the Notre Dame basketball team. But over a period of time, I discovered, you're good enough to make this team. You might not start, but you're good enough to sit on that bench. And I never was able to overcome the feeling of intimidation. And I grew into my physicality late. I was always real skinny. And I don't know, I let that get in my head, and
So you regret not going out for the team
not
your
trying out.
freshman year, not
Not,
trying out.
not
Yeah.
trying out. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's actually a great perspective. A lot of us uh, either beat ourselves up about a regret, but one thing I was very conscious of all my life is, hey, I'll take some chances here, but what I never want to do is live in regret, because living in regret is also um, uh, something that as you're, I think even being honest enough and to share with us, comes and backs and haunts you. At the same time, I've also been punished for not for pushing it too far. And yeah, I think that's, if I would say the one, I don't have a lot of regrets, and it's not that I'm trying to dodge the question. I married a career woman, which again is fantastic in a lot of ways, but I didn't realize that you're going to give up a part of your life. There's only so much time and energy, and so she's very, very good at what she does. She's a straight A student. She went to Berkeley. She's beautiful. She's all of the things that um, I guess I'm not, but there's a reason why we're together, and there's a reason uh, of why the relationship works, right? Because I complete her too,
Yep.
and I regret maybe not getting the help to overcome some of my challenges. I think I mentioned to you I'm dyslexic, and that's something that I knew for pretty much all my life, but I avoided it to try to create a persona to cover that up out of shame. And I regret not getting a support system early on that I think could have helped me work through some things. On the other hand, that's who makes us who we are, and I believe that I will make the best of this, and in the end, uh, I'll be a better human being, and I'll have empathy. And I love this conversation about humility. There's some great quotes, but humility gives you empathy, and without going through those challenges, I think you grow up to be an asshole. You really can, because you've never had to overcome challenges. You never had to be at a low point to have empathy for others that do struggle, whether it's physical or mental or other ways. So I try not to live in regret in that way. I try to look at it as what is the upside of this, and how can I make this? How can it make me better, not worse?
No, totally. I think a couple thoughts. I think as I listen to you talk, isn't it awesome and clear now at our stage of life how important it is to seek out mentorship, seek out wisdom, seek out guidance. And some of us are very fortunate to be gifted with that in the form of a great dad or a great coach or a great teacher. But when you bump into somebody as a young man that says, "Hey, I see something in you and I want to help you develop that into something valuable so you can serve other people." That's a life-changing introduction. And not only do you have to pay attention to those because you bump into them your whole life. It's not a question of bumping into them, it's a question of recognizing the opportunity. And that's why I think you are naturally inclined, as am I, to be mentors, to help other people. They could be young people, they could be people our own age, but that inclination is valuable. And I think those people are everywhere, but I don't think very many people think I need to go seek out someone who is extremely successful doing what I want to do and asking for their assistance in return for my energy, effort, and enthusiasm. And that might be the most important life lesson you could share with someone who has not yet found his mentor.
I agree, and I think it's a good time to talk about how we came up with the name, the Imperfect Mens Club. There's an origin story there that I think it grew over about a 2 or 3 month period, where we had the initial idea, and then I'm a marketer. I think of it as who you're serving and customers and those kind of things. But when we started really doing the arithmetic on who we're serving, who we're helping, or who we hope to help. It started to get to this very narrow group, because those are conversations that we can have, that at the moment is difficult just because of the pandemic, but in general. And these are also the conversations that we used to have in a bar or in a club. And their clubs are that's a word in itself, and that's one of the words in the imperfect. And then the imperfect part was a story I shared with you that I used to tell my children when they were growing up, in a funny way. They come from school, they'd be frustrated, or they start to make fun about somebody, and I'd say, um, and I would laugh, and I said, calm down, right? We are our thoughts. And then I'd say, the imperfection is the perfection. And it is. It's that weirdness and all of that. That's the perfection. But we live in a society, particularly where I live in Northern California, of 1% of the high performers concentrated in a particular area. And we're overachievers. Americans particularly have become overachievers. So an A isn't good enough. We need an A plus. A 4.0 isn't good enough. And so there's this obsession with being perfect. In fact, it's even part of our vocabulary. So yeah, that's how we came up with the word, or it was your recommendation to use the word imperfect. And
Yeah, yeah, I
yeah,
think.
and in the men's club, we're going to focus on a conversation with a group of men that grew up in a time, that have a similar background, and these conversations will be open, honest, and they'll be specific to that person. So that's my version of it. I think I love the way it turned out, and yeah, what do you think, Mark?
Yeah, no, I appreciate you bringing that up. I think at the end of the day, you can't serve everybody as much as you might like to. And if women want to listen and young men want to listen, I think there's value in that audience participating and sharing feedback, because I think at the end of the day, we all have different perspectives based on our life experiences, based on, how old we are, whether our role was as a female in society or a male in society, what our professional roles were. So everybody has something to bring to the table. But we decided that if we were to just sit down and talk over a couple of beers and shoot the shit like no one else was listening, who would be most interested in that conversation? And clearly it's men our age. That doesn't mean everyone else might be able to get something out of it. And the reason I chose imperfect was not to be apologetic in any capacity, but to find some common ground. Like, you're not alone. You're not. An expectation of perfection is a fool's expectation, right? And imperfection, it's just part of the deal. Everybody has their flaws, everybody has their strengths, and focusing on, your flaws is kind of silly. So no, I like it. I bounced it off a few people before we plugged into it, and I think you did too. And I think the general response was, hey, that's pretty cool. I kind of get that. you know
Yes, and I'll do a backstory on the word club. So again, I played rugby for 20 straight seasons, was um, a national champion at both Division II and Division I. And what I learned about rugby in comparison to American sports was, well, first of all, the reason I played it was because it's about uh, as a physical of a sport you can play without going to jail. and but I didn't go to college. So when I was graduated from high school, I was a cabinet maker for the first 4 or 5 years. And I grew up in an area where, nothing good happens typically to 18, 19-year-olds that haven't left for a reason. And that's still pretty typical to this day. And I ran into somebody, almost got in a fight with somebody at a gym, and they asked me, hey, to come out and play rugby. But what I learned, the difference between rugby, which is a club sport, and a team sport, is that, first of all, everybody in a town, let's just say you go to England or other parts of the world, um, that club is not just for the sport. That's the difference between a club and a team. It's the entire community. And there's always a place for somebody at the club to have a beer. At one time, they were Some of the clubs in rugby were men's clubs, men only, but also they've grown to everybody, even the 80-year-old or the 18-year-old or the 8-year-old on Saturday has a place to go, and it becomes part of who raises you. The other thing different about rugby and say football is that after every game, you would not just shake hands with the teammate you just played, but you would drink beer and you'd make them dinner, and that's a very traditional. It's still to this day. So I started to see the value in that, and then as I traveled throughout the world at different clubs, it's something I wanted to bring, back to the U.S. And so that's the backstory of the club, the word club. And then in terms of men, yeah, I think some of the best conversations you've had was either a men's Bible study or at a bar with men talking. So I do think the dynamics change when women aren't involved in the conversation, just as they are when just women talk to each other. So
Yeah, I think the club concept, you call it family, you call it community, you can call it a lot of different things, but this whole idea of it made me think that, when I was a kid, we lived in a suburban community. It was really nice. I feel very, very grateful for it all. But the thing I remember most is the doors were never locked. They were always open. And if you walked into the kitchen at my house at any moment, during any moment of any given day, particularly on a weekend, you would see all kinds of other kids in there and sometimes other adults. And food would be being served and drink would be being had and stories were being told. And I really miss that. And I really, this is a whole slew of topics for other episodes, but that's what the club seems to sound like to me, is that sense of belonging. And I think that people that don't have a sense of belonging or don't stand for something have such a higher instance of getting lost and getting then attracted to clubs of other types. Then now we're talking about gangs and things of that nature. And I think that's why gangs exist, because the kids in those gangs don't have families to serve that function. But the other thing that struck me as you were talking in terms of regrets and not really focusing or dwelling on them is I think we all fall victim to this idea of comparison, like comparison to other people of our age, or look at the size of that guy's boat or that guy's house, or how come I'm not doing that well, or people, especially celebrities on TV, there's this shiny veneer. It's like, yeah, some of them I'm sure are doing fine, but some of them are probably miserable, and it's like, stop comparing yourself to other people. It's like the only person you have to satisfy is yourself. And I know it's a slightly different topic, but I wanted to get it in there because we were talking about something similar earlier.
No, I'm so glad you brought that up. In fact, I recently heard a quote. It said, "Comparison is the thief of your happiness." We often compare ourselves to others, and and then um, and then again start beating ourselves up or creating an unrealistic expectation because you don't know what's going on in their life. You don't realize all the things they've either had to sacrifice or their backstory either. But we don't see that. We just compare ourselves. But yeah, I really appreciate that. And let's talk about that. You mentioned your father used to have different quotes, but let's talk about quotes and how that conversation we're having with ourselves, which is the most important conversation we're ever going to have, often is things that you either heard from your father or these different quotes. But yeah, what do you think of that? First of all, about um, comparison is the thief of happiness.
Well, it is. It absolutely is, because you're never going to be the best in every category that you observe in the lives of other people around you. I mean, you might be the best athlete, but you might not have the most money. That guy has two boats. I only have one boat. Like, when you say it like that, how silly it sounds that we would ever spend any time comparing our lives to anyone else, but we do it all the time.
Mhm.
We do it all the time. I was watching just yesterday, actually, last night. I turned on a Ken Burns documentary on Mark Twain, and I didn't. I thought I knew a lot about Mark Twain, but that guy not only was a competent, capable, outstanding writer, lecturer, comedian, and sayer of sooths, but there was a ton of misery in that guy's life. He
Oh,
lost
sure.
a ton, and he was
Hmm.
suicidal on a couple different. He went
Hmm.
bankrupt, And so that's a perfect example of, we don't know about this guy. We don't know what's going on behind closed doors. So
Right.
appreciate him for what he gives us, but don't think for any stretch of the imagination that this guy is able to be devoid of hardship or misery.
Yeah.
It's not the way it
So,
works.
yeah. So what are some of the quotes that you live by?
I like quotes and I grab onto them, and my memory doesn't serve me very well right now on the spot. But my dad is the one. Life is simple, Mark. Life is simple, and we continue to try and complicate it. And the extent to which we can keep life simple, life will be much easier and much more rewarding. And you can take that a lot of different places. I told you the other day, every time I left the house, almost every time, he would say to me, the last thing he would say after hugging me, he would say, "Remember who you are." And for the longest time, I really didn't know what that was all about. And I still don't actually know what he meant by it. We've talked about it a couple times, but I always thought it was, remember who you are, be grateful for what you have, be aware of what you have, understand that the actions and words that you take into the world will impact your family and friends. You're taking our last name, our heritage, our reputation into the world. So be conscious and appreciative of what you have and who you are in everything that you do. And that little tiny reminder, I think it was effective. I really do.
Oh,
You know,
there's no question that shaped your character. I
yeah.
mean, I see it to this day. But yeah, that actually reminds me of something that we both do mentoring, but I started well, it's a nonprofit, but really turned more into a mentoring program. And that quote, the teacher learns more than the student. There's a lot to say for that. Even as you're, say, coaching career people, right? You're learning as much as they are often. And so I would take a group of high school football seniors every year, um, and I would have I do a couple of events throughout the year. I wasn't an on-field coach, but I was an off-field coach, and I started to realize that uh, the most difficult period in a young man's life is when he goes from his senior year. It really is the difference. And obviously, a lot of times when we speak, we're speaking of ourselves. But I remember when I was playing football at the time, and I would call it the last whistle and the last bell. So when the last whistle blows, you go from hero to zero. And a couple of things at that very moment start. First of all, football season is over. Basketball season just started. So if you thought you were the shit on campus, it's the basketball players take that role immediately as soon as that last whistle blows. The also thing that was difficult was how much the coaches liked you up until that very point. In fact, you could even see it start to change as the season was getting later because those coaches didn't need you as much. They were much more interested in the juniors that were going to be back. So as soon as that whistle blows, your life changes. And I just felt it, even in the locker room, everything was different. And then, the school year goes on. And when that last bell rings in June, in the United States of America, you have been released into capitalism, but you've been prepared for socialism. K through 12 is preparing you for socialism.
Yep.
And you're being released into capitalism. And that was a moment where you go, you don't know anything. You just don't. You're 18 years old. And your life changes in a big way. And if you're fortunate enough to go to college, they put you in a nice either fraternity or a dorm and kind of give you alcohol and girls and that. But if you don't go to college, those are dangerous times, right? And that's often to your point about gangs. Another thing about human beings that we want really after oxygen and water and food and shelter, what we want is to matter. We want to belong to something. We want to have contribution and to be valued. Those are normal, very important parts of a human being. And again, going back to the United States of America, we have a situation now that continues to grow, but we also have a 38 or 28% dropout rate from that ninth grader. So if you don't, I'm only speaking of the kids that made it through high school football, but we lost close to 30% of them because they didn't belong to anything. They don't have the sport. It's never about sports. It's about belonging. It's about being validated. The message I would have with these seniors, I'd take them to my office and we'd sit down and have dinner. It was just the seniors. And I'd sit down and I'd say, you got to give up your story. And they would, every guy. And it became emotional because everybody has a story. But the idea was that they'd see each other's own humility, but also each other's how much we're all struggling. And the question was, why do you play football and who do you play football for? And that often would be, of course, their mother or an uncle or an aunt, somebody that was raising them. And then the table, we go around the table and I'd say 90% of life is showing up. And if you show up, you have a chance. Don't let anybody tell you that you can't do something. But if you don't show up, it's the only thing I can guarantee you that if you don't show up, nothing happens. And those are, I mean, if you can give one person advice or talk about a quote, is show up.
Yeah, Jim, in the context of like career advisory stuff, helping people find work, and the flip side of that is dealing with clients that are trying to hire people that have critical skills, and the hiring process is so broken. But to your point, I think across the board, what's the most important thing that you can give to an employee or a consultant or a colleague or a partner? It's not money, it's not even opportunity, it's appreciation. It's the sense that they matter. It's the opportunity to belong and to be appreciated. And I can't tell you how many companies lose people they think they're going to retain forever because they stop appreciating them. They keep giving them raises, they keep giving them performance reviews, but they stop appreciating them. And I think that's one of the most important things that I could share with anybody that's in a management position that's hiring people. The kids that you're talking about in your office having dinner, they're all petrified of the unknown, and they're
They
ill
are.
prepared. They're ill prepared because of your awesome point that we're preparing them for socialism and then we're chucking them into capitalism. That's the piece of advice that I think we all are able to appreciate the people around us more, be more grateful for the people around us. That's a really, really powerful thing to do for someone else, to appreciate them, to recognize them, to acknowledge them. I would hope that everybody listening can tell this thing's going to go in a million different interesting directions, and it's going to be a lot of fun, and we're going to have a lot of things to talk about, because just here in this one episode we probably identified 100 topics that we could go much deeper into.
Yeah, the other thing on that one I would add to that I had written down is the quote, "Be so good they can't ignore you."
Yep.
There's a lot to say for that, because if you focus on not wishing it was easier, wishing you were better. My whole after I did this for over 12 years, so it's hundreds of young men. It was really just shaping their minds and giving them permission to be successful. And what makes you, or what breaks you makes you, and the challenge that they have actually makes them extra special if they can overcome them, and just really seeing how that translates over. So yeah, be so good they can't ignore you. And then the one advice I would give somebody today versus a quote that I recently heard was the quality of your life depends on your thoughts and feelings, and it does. And that's that the most important conversation you'll ever have is a conversation with yourself.
You know who Sam Harris is?
No.
So he's a pretty well known guy, intellectual author, speaker. I believe he's a noted atheist as well. He has he debates theologians. Fascinating guy. But I watched him walk out on a stage on a TED Talk one time, and he began. I'm paraphrasing, but you get the concept. He began with, "What if we walked around all day talking to other people, saying the things that we were saying to ourselves in our own heads?"
Mm-hmm.
Then he paused, and the audience was like acknowledging that, kind of murmuring and laughing. Then he said something like, "We probably get beat up a lot. It's like we're horrible to ourselves."
Hmm.
Self-talk is horrible. We would never say things to other people that we say to ourselves. And so we are our thoughts and our feelings and our emotions. And I think a lot of times guys in our generation, they either don't acknowledge that, dismiss that, or believe that that makes them weak or vulnerable, and they choose to ignore it. And so I think that's a real flaw in the middle-aged man community of today, because we grew up in the circumstances that we grew up in, and toughness was valued. I mean, John Wayne was a dude, you know, cigarette smoking was a thing, you know. I mean, leather jackets and jeans. I mean, it's it's generational, but I think we all beat each other up way too much. I know I do. And as soon as what I've developed, I guess, is a better sense of when I'm doing it, and then a quicker trigger to stop doing it.
So if you were to go to your own funeral and you wanted people to talk about you as you weren't there, what would you want them to say?
Yeah, I've heard things like this before, but before I go there, I think that whole cliche of, you know, man makes plans and God laughs, you know. So like we
Good one
actually
too.
have control over our lives.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I mean, I would want people to say, you know, he gave a shit, you know, he cared, he listened, you know, he was generous, he was kind, he was funny. And you know, if I ever needed a shoulder to lean on, he would always be there. You know, those are the, I mean, it wouldn't be anything about my athleticism or my stature or my material possessions or my professional accomplishments. You know, you always hear these stories about people that go and talk to older people in nursing homes that are on their deathbed and having these discussions, and everyone to a T said, I should have spent more time with my family, I should have spent more time with my kids, I should have spent more time enjoying those types of things instead of striving for success or, you know, professional accomplishment or wealth. And I'm never going to have to say that. I feel really grateful that that's not going to be one of my things, you know. And I don't spend, like you said, I don't spend a lot of time on regret. After I learn from it, I move forward. And most of the only really bad decisions I think I've ever made are not making decisions, right? Because when you are decisive, this is another thing my dad loves to speak of. Leaders make decisions. Successful people make decisions, and people that aren't leaders and people that aren't successful in life, not money, um, they leave those decisions up to other people. And I think that's what's happening socially and politically right now. There are too many people that are suggesting that, well, the government can take care of me or the government can take care of them. No, I want those decisions. I want to decide what I can say, I want to decide what I can think, and I want to decide what I can do. And I will seek out the advice of other people, and I think you can learn from everybody, but the final say is mine.
You're right. It's a decision. And often we think a decision means you have to act, and not to act is also a decision. And a decision is how you respond to something. Um, and that's, again, one of the most difficult things to do. And one of the messages that I pushed out to these young men, but also to myself that I struggle with every day is it's not what happens to you, it's how you respond to what happens to you. That is a decision. The best decisions I made was not to act. And I heard another quote. I still think of this all the time. Even a broken clock is right twice a day. There's these guys that play like the stock market, right? We have a lot of our money in mutual funds and things like that, and they're doing quite well. But it's a timing. Life is timing, and sometimes if you're moving around, then you're not even around to enjoy uh, the benefits of not moving around. So it's not what you do in life. Sometimes it's what you don't do, and what you don't do is you don't get somebody pregnant when you're 17, because that's going to be a bit of a drain on your income for a period of time. You don't marry somebody that had all the signs. There's a lot of, it's not what I did at this stage in my life as much as what I didn't do that now is paying dividends. It's paying off in a big way.
I think restraint is maybe one of the most important decisions that you can make periodically the rest of your life. When you said that earlier, I was thinking to myself, what did you decide not to do? Punch that guy in the face?
Yeah. Yeah. And boy, there's been times when you wanted to do it.
No
And
question. No
yeah,
question.
but self-discipline and self-control is the most difficult thing to do. And it takes a lot of work. But often, going back to your point before, you start comparing yourself to other people and you start acting like other people, then you're not authentic, and you do stupid shit that you can't take back.
Yeah,
And
you lose yourself, you lose who you are. So, no, I think that, Jim, as is always the case, you and I can talk forever about this stuff. But I think I just want to thank our listeners for listening to Mark and Jim on the Imperfect Men's Club podcast, and we look forward to having you back in future episodes. Take care, everybody.
have a great day.